Okay, I think we're good to go now. Welcome everybody. Glad everybody joined me today. It's a beautiful day here at Hackberry Farm. If you don't know me, my name's Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live from the barn at Hackberry Farm, and for the second month in a row, we're gonna have our chicken lottery. So this is not my house I live in. This is another building we have on the farm. It's called the barn. It's all finished out in here, as you can see. But one of the things I do is whenever the weather's nice, I just open the doors and open the windows and let the breeze blow through. But the danger is, if you look behind me at the door, chickens like to roam in every now and then. So, how our chicken lottery works, if you're the first one to spot a chicken walking in and you mention it in the chat, then I'll give you this coupon from Pro Prints to give you. This is a $20 off print credit. So whatever kind of print you want, whatever size you want, that's 20 bucks off. And they're a good company to deal with. I've dealt with them a lot. I've given away a lot of these coupons in the past for my workshop participants. They always do a good job. But again, all you got to do is look. I make sure all the chickens are out of here, so there's no chickens in here now. But when one walks in the door, if you're the first one to notice it and put it in the chat, I'll follow up with you after the fact, and I'll figure out your email address, and I'll just email you a copy of that instead of sending the physical copy of it. So we'll make sure we got that going on good. Today we're going to talk about the little things, and it's like any other kind of activity you do in your life. There's some basic fundamentals that you have to understand about photography, but really a lot of times going from being and this is so subjective, but going from being an amateur photographer or a beginner photographer, I should say, to one, a photographer where you're consistent in your abilities, you're consistent in your results, and everything just clicks right for you. Oftentimes involves a lot of little things that you've got to do just right. So that's what we're going to talk about today, are all the little things that are involved in really taking your photography to the next level. As a lot of you guys know, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I spent 16 years as a teacher in the Texas public school system. I was an agriculture teacher and really taught at that profession at the highest level. I won all kinds of awards for my teaching when I was there and the things I did with the kids. And I think a lot of it boils down to one reason, and that's because I really had an innate understanding of how people learn. And so even with photography, everybody in this audience, including me, are no different than high school kids. When you're learning something new, you tend to learn it. People learn at different rates. They learn in different ways. But I always try to figure out what box are people in their learning journey. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today a little bit too. And so what I mean is, are you just a beginner? I mean, do you know nothing about the subject? And I doubt most people that follow me or go on workshops, they know a little bit. They're just looking to improve their skills. And so then you have the people who are really experts and they know virtually everything there is to know, or at least everything they want to know in their lane. I would consider myself that. I'm not a, say very good. I don't do it. I don't do weddings or babies or stuff like that. But in my lane of photography, I feel like I've got a pretty good knowledge base and I really understand the cause and effect of when you change the setting on a camera, what's going to happen. And when you uh if the lighting, if the sun is, if the sun's behind a cloud, what the effects are going to be. If you've got a subject in front of a dark background, how the meter is going to handle it. So I've got a pretty good understanding of all that. But I think most people are right there in the middle. They're kind of trying to figure out those things that will sort of take them to whatever that next level for them is, and it's different for everybody. And I talk about that in a lot of generalities when I talk about the next level for people, because what may be right for me may be different for my wife or maybe different for my son. Since everyone's on kind of a different continuum on their learning journey, you got to figure out kind of what that next level is. So the things I'm going to talk about today are really a lot of those little things. Again, if you read my quote, this is straight from the webinar description that I sent out the other day. Everyone knows that exposure and composition are keys to good photography, and they absolutely are. Those are two of the what I call the fundamentals of photography. I think the fundamentals of photography it's a three-legged stool. You got to understand exposure, you got to understand composition, you need to understand good camera handling techniques. Those are the three basic fundamentals of photography. And so a lot of people, that's when you go from being beginner to really understanding that's when you start understanding those things. And then the other things I call the little things, are those little strategies that you can employ each and every day to help fill in the gaps so you can become a photographer that takes pictures and you get a good one every now and then to one that becomes more consistent. And I think that's really the thing for everybody. I think people that, if you took the time to be here today, or if you took the time to sign up and want to rewatch this webinar, I really do think a lot of people, that's the point they try to get to more than anything is just consistency. Every time you take the picture, whether you look at it on the back of a camera or not, you've got a pretty good idea of whether that picture is going to turn out like you envision it in your mind. And so uh, that's the point I hope to get to everybody to as we talk about photography. And again, thanks for joining me today. I know all y'all had other places you could probably spend your time at, but I really appreciate y'all taking the time to spend this time with me today. And with that said, I want this to be a little bit of a dialogue and not a monologue. So if you want to chime in and ask a question as I go along, you'll have to hit your unmute button to speak, or you can pop it into the chat box. But since I'm a one-man show today, I'm going to have to get out of this screen to see the chat. So that if you have ask a question in the chat, I'll have to go back to it at some point. But if you've got a question as we go along, just ask the question, unmute your microphone, ask the question, I'll answer it. And then if you don't mind, when you're done, mute your microphone back again because it helps keep some of the ambient noise out of this presentation and off the video. So with that said, by the way, I updated my presentation. I tend to use a lot of the same pictures over and over again, but these are all fresh photos that were taken on a workshop this spring somewhere from the Smoky Mountains to Costa Rica to Death Valley. One of the workshops that we were on was where these pictures were made that uh, help kind of illustrate this whole presentation I'm doing today. And again, whenever I go out and take pictures, the thing I can't stress this enough. The thing I try to build in what I do is consistency. Now we're going to make mistakes. I still make mistakes all the time. I've shot millions of pictures in my life, and it surprises me how many mistakes that I still make. But I'm going to share one little thing with you that I remind myself all the time of, and I think it'll help you continue to minimize those mistakes. So here's the little things, and I mean these in no particular order at all. So this isn't best to worst, or this is just a random order that I thought about it in. I asked for feedback from a couple of people and asked them, what do you think the little things are? And this is just a compendium of things that I thought are really going to help people out whenever they go out to shoot pictures. And this is a big one here. If I had to pick one, I don't really consider myself a controversial person. I'm not a bomb thrower. My mom and dad always taught me when I was a kid, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. So I really try to be positive about this stuff all the time. I try to be non-controversial because when it comes to a creative endeavor like photography, there's a few mechanical and technical rights and wrongs, but a lot of it is just kind of how you feel and how you feel about your images and things like that. But one thing I will stand on is I always strive to get it right in the camera. And a lot of that comes from my old school mentality. I shot film, I'm 55 now. I started shooting pictures when I was 17. And the first, gosh, well, let me think about this. I can tell you this. I was telling someone the story the other day. Come September of this year, 2025, will be 20 years that I switched to digital cameras. So uh, I went from 17 to 35 years old shooting pictures with film. And with film, it stung to get it wrong. And so one of the things I tried to do because I didn't couldn't afford to get it wrong when you're shooting film, because that was back when I had a young family. Kids were little. In fact, I'm trying to think when I was 35, when I started shooting film, my daughter would have been 5 years old. My son would have been one. And so I had a young family, all the things that you have when I was teaching school, all those things you have when you're young, when you're that age, mortgage, saving for kids' college, saving for retirement, all those things. So it was expensive if you got it wrong. And so I decided early on that I just want to try to get as right as I could. Well, that same mentality went with me when it comes to digital photography. Now, we've got all these tools to help us fix pictures after the fact. But the one thing I wonder, and they're valuable tools. I don't mean to say I never use them, but I do strive to get it right in the camera because I think photography, if you take the word photography out of the conversation and you add mechanics or your house builder or your doctor or anything else, there's very few activities or professions that you can think of where people say, "Oh, let's just kind of get it close now. We'll fix it later." I mean, you wouldn't accept that in your doctor. You wouldn't accept it in your dentist or your housekeeper if you've got one, or your contractors or your mechanics. Everything else, you expect everyone else to get it right when they do the job the first time. But in a sense, a lot of us photographers will tend to kind of fall back on, yeah, I didn't get the composition just right, but I'll fix it later. Or it's got a lot of noise in it. I'll fix it. I'll get it right later. And so one of the things I try to encourage people to do when we're out shooting pictures is just try to get it right there in the moment. Because one big thing it'll do that you may or may not have thought of, it'll save you a lot of time on the back end. It'll save you a lot of time from the post-processing part. And you'd be surprised if you just do the math and how many pictures you may work on a year and just multiply it out and then divide it by, uh, it's a pretty simple formula to use. How many pictures you took times how many seconds per picture you're going to spend. Divide that by 60 twice. That'll give you a total number of hours you spent editing this year, estimated hours. And so one of the things I know I'd rather do is I'd rather spend time outdoors taking more pictures because that's one of the little things that I'll talk about later too is how to, really the key to getting better. Uh, it'll save you time post-processing. It'll save a lot of hassle. And if you really strive to get it right, and again, I'm not saying you're gonna get it right every time because I still make mistakes, but if I at least have the mindset where I strive just to get it as right as I can in the camera, I feel like my productivity goes up, my consistency goes up, my state of mind goes up. I'm just happier because if I can look on the back of the camera and it looks pretty good right there, I know I really, really nailed it. So work on getting it right in the camera. Getting it right goes back to those fundamentals I talked about: composition, exposure, uh, camera handling, which is, don't always rely on noise reduction and high ISOs. They're nice tools to have, but again, I would just rather get it right in the camera. And I think there's a lot of value to having that mentality. And that again is true whether we're talking about sports or anything else. Just get it right the first time. And then if you need to fix it, you've still got those tools available later on. But I think if you strive to get it right, your confidence in your abilities go way, way up because you're not putting all your stock into what the software can do later. And at that point, trying to figure out what all you can do or can't do to the picture later on. So I always try to get it right in the camera. That picture right there, I took it 2 days ago, and this was at Redlands Ranch, and that was a quail that came in. I just understanding photography and understanding all those basics, the fundamentals of photography. And I'll talk a little bit about my mindset on this. The camera, the way this looked in RAW right out of the camera does not differ much, other than colors pop a little bit because with RAW you have to add some amount of post processing. It's a flat image, but other than the colors popping a little bit, this is almost this is 95. Or I don't know. I'll say 99% of how it came out of the camera, just like this. It's uncropped. Everything just worked out right. I knew what to do. I love quail, and it made me really happy when I saw this picture, and that was from the striving to get it right in the camera. So, this is a picture I took in Florida last January, and the same thing. Just if you understand how the cameras work, and we're going to talk about all that stuff again, I just think it's always important to try to get it right in the camera. And then the next thing I want to talk about is knowing when the shot is there or not. And I jokingly call this or lovingly call it the Kenny Rogers rule of photography. Sometimes you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Yesterday I was out with some folks and we're just doing a little safari drive down some county roads, and we saw it was about 10 in the morning, I think, and we saw some turkey vultures sitting on a fence post. The sun was already high in the sky behind them, and when you looked at them, there was just no color in it, and just with your naked eyes, it just there was nothing interesting about the shot at all. Now, to illustrate a concept that was teaching them how to do, we went ahead and shot pictures of it, but a lot of times on a shot like that, no matter what I can do, there's nothing I can do to make that a good picture. I mean, the sun's in the wrong spot, the shadows are bad, it's a dark subject. There's just a million things conspiring against me. And so I think there's knowledge in just understanding when you can take a good picture, when you can't take a good picture. I know whenever I've had the opportunity to mentor people via email or Zoom or wherever else, and they'll send me some pictures that they're trying they saw a nice picture, had a good opportunity, or they had an opportunity and they just were unable to get the picture to come out right. A lot of times it's if you're trying to shoot a picture midday of a duck on water somewhere because of the angle of the sun and because of your angle to the duck and everything else is conspiring against you. Sometimes there's nothing you can do to make a good picture. And so there's a little bit of empowerment knowing when you can make a good picture, when you can't make a good picture, and again, taking the Kenny Rogers advice, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, because there's just sometimes no matter what you do, you can't take a good picture. Another example I think about too is I was in Alaska a few years ago and we were photographing bears, and we were just out walking around maybe 11 o'clock in the morning, something like that, and we saw some bears and they were way, way across the field. and everybody tried to take pictures. And when we got back, no one's pictures looked good. And I didn't take any pictures of that because I knew what they were going to look like. And that's a good example of when you can't make a good picture. So it was a swampy area. The bears were out in a sedge field. They were 200 yards away. The sun was beating down on the water, so the air was what some people describe as dirty air. There's a lot of heat bubbles coming up, rising up off the ground. We're trying to get our lenses to do too much. They're just too far away. In a situation like that, no matter what you can do or what kind of software process you can apply, there's little you can do to make that a good picture. So it's okay sometimes to understand that and then just enjoy the scene and then work hard to find a better opportunity later on. But I think there's a lot of power in just knowing sometimes there's a good shot and sometimes there's not a good shot. And this is a big one here, and I'm guilty of this as well. I was out at Redlands Ranch recently, and we were sitting in the blind waiting for animals to show up, and I started thinking about my gear, and because I've got a new Canon R5 Mark II, and I do this when I've got the opportunity. I do this with other people's gear as well because it helps me as a teacher. It helps me, even though I don't shoot Canon every day. I do understand. If someone needs to make a change to their camera, where to find it in the Nikon menus or in the Sony menus or whatever else. And so a lot of times I look at other people's cameras, but in that slack time when I'm sitting there, and you can do it on the couch at night, you can do it when you're passing the time in the middle of the day or wherever else. I think it's valuable to take the time and look through your menus and just understand where things exist in your menus and understand the different uh, things your camera is capable of because these mirrorless cameras today are miraculous. I learned something just the other day. I think it's called HDRPQ. That is a feature that Canon has. And honestly, if I've seen it before, I didn't pay much attention to it. But when I read about it, when I found it in the menus and I thought, what is that? And I Googled it on my phone from the blind and read about it, I thought, well, that might be a good landscape tool to use from now on. So I discovered a possible tool I could use just by taking the time to really try to know my gear and understand it. I am guilty, and that's one of the things I'll talk about in a minute. I'm guilty of trying to find that simple lane to get from point A to point B and just doing that over and over again, where sometimes I put blinders onto myself and try to where I don't really explore other things my cameras can do. But I think it's valuable, whether you ever use it or not, I think it's valuable to know all the tools that you have available to you in your camera and just understand what all it can do. Good example, if he's listening today, I'm not going to pick on him at all, but when we were doing the Redlands Ranch workshop a couple weeks ago, we were photographing some just beautiful cactus flowers. And so the guy's camera, he was having trouble for it locking on focus, and he just didn't know that he had a thing called focus peaking, where if you've used it before, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't used it before, it's a great tool in all these mirrorless cameras that'll when something's in focus, it'll show colors on the highlights, blue, yellow, red, whatever color you choose, it'll show it on the highlights. It's really really valuable when you have your camera at weird angles and you're trying to get things in focus. And so I think it's a valuable thing, but the only way that you know that that's there is by taking the time to understand and know your gear and just again, just you may not use it all the time, but you're at least aware that some of these features are there and you're able to use them whenever the need arises. By the way, that bobwhite quail started calling right after that too. So that was pretty cool to see as well. I'm going to try to take a minute to flesh this out. And I don't mean this as a critique at all if you're guilty of it too, but I think there's a double-edged sword here. The internet is full of great information, but the internet's also full of great information. That's the double-edged sword. You got it if it's available, but a lot of times when I'm teaching people and we're out on a workshop or something, or we're doing a webinar or whatever else that we have a chance to convene with one another and talk about photography, uh, it seems like there's a tendency of people will hear all these things, and then when it gets time to utilize some of those lessons in the field, they start to overthink the process. It just becomes too much. Should I use what focus mode should I use, or what what should I use, back button focus or front button focus, or what exposure mode's best, or should I shoot high ISO, low ISO? And a lot of times those concurrent thoughts start running through people's mind, and it just gets confusing. And I'll tell you a good example for me where that happens. Uh, I've been playing the guitar since I was about 16 or 17 years old, but I kind of plateaued in my skills at some point because I put all of my creative efforts into learning to be a better photographer and not learning to be a better guitarist. Well, over the past year or so, I've been wanting to try to get better at the guitar. And so again, I look online and I look at all these tutorials and I just get confused over time because there's so many different ways to learn to do the same thing. And so I get frustrated by the process and I tend to just it's easier just to do nothing at that point or to try to don't learn to try not to learn anything new. And I realize for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people too, you just got to get to a point where you just don't overthink the process. I tell it's really as simple as this. I tell people this a lot. If you've heard this analogy, forgive me, but I'm gonna talk it again because I think it's a really good analogy. If you look at Google Maps on how to get from whoever's listening today from your house to my house here in Dodge City or north of Dodge City, Texas, if you do Google Maps and you ask it to give you directions, it's going to give you three choices, but all three choices are going to get you to the same spot. And so that's a good analogy with photography. And so one of the things, and I'll mention this again, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but one of the things I'll mention again is all the time is I think it's incumbent for people to figure out how they can get their consistent results and then just do that same thing over and over and over again. If you're comfortable shooting manual and you know exactly how to manipulate all the controls, the fundamentals of photography, the exposure and composition and camera handling, if you know how to do that and you can almost do it automatically, I think you hurt yourself if you start overthinking the process. One of the things that I talk about a lot uh, on some workshops is I shoot aperture priority. I have almost the whole time I've been taking pictures. And that's my way of not overthinking it because I decide when I shoot aperture priority, I decide what the aperture is going to be, which if you look at a lot of these pictures you see, they've got the really soft background. And so you can see each and every time I'm shooting wildlife pretty much the same way. I don't deviate much from that, but I shoot aperture priority because I choose the aperture, I'll choose the ISO, and I'll let the camera decide what the shutter speed is going to be because the cameras are pretty good. They can do that. And all I have to decide then is, do I need to add exposure compensation? It works really quick for me, but that works for me. It's not the way for everybody. But what I tell people all the time is well, let me back up one step. And the reason why it works for me is because if I'm in the field, this is going to happen. If I'm in the field and action's going to happen quick, if I've got to think about too much to take the picture, if there's too many buttons I've got to turn, or I've got to remember whether I'm on front button focus or back button focus or all these different things that I've got to run through my mind to make sure it's right before I even take the picture, I'm probably going to mess it up. And so my way of not overthinking it is just to adopt a pretty simple workflow. I shoot aperture priority almost every single time I take a picture. 85% of the time, according to my math that I've done recently, using an analytics program for all my metadata, 85% of the time I shoot aperture priority. And so that way my results become more consistent each and every time. It's like if you ask some of the greatest hitters in baseball, how are you so consistent? I remember reading a Sports Illustrated article a long time about Boston Red Sox great Wade Boggs. He was the greatest hitter of that era. And Wade Boggs he had just a pretty simple swing that he'd do each and every time. Wouldn't overthink it. And so that's what I say on photography. But what I will tell people, and this is the last point I was going to make on this, uh, whenever I talk about using aperture priority, I'll tell people, I'll show you how I do it. But the thing is, if you're pretty comfortable doing the way you do it, don't let me change the way you do things. If you're getting good success with the way you're doing it, just do that same thing each and every time. Don't overthink it. And I think there's a lot of power in that. Uh, I've got a friend here locally. His dad overthinks a lot, and I'm not going to say his name because I love his dad to death. I've known him almost my whole life, but he it's analysis paralysis. We've heard that before. We tend to overthink it, where you either lose opportunities or you mess things up even more than you would before. I think there's a lot of value in just taking the picture, trying to get it right the first time, and then learning from your mistakes in the end. And this is a pretty big one too, as part of the fundamentals. Understand how your camera sees the scene. And I think I released a video on YouTube just a couple weeks about this on how the background affects how your camera meters. And it's really pretty simple in my mind. It's really pretty simple in my mind. Whenever you take a picture, one of three things are going to happen. Either your camera's going to get the exposure right, it's going to underexpose it or overexpose it. It's unless I'm bad at math, it's almost mathematically impossible for it not to do one of those three things. It's going to get the exposure right, it's going to tend to overexpose the image or underexpose the image. So, as a photographer, what I need to understand is what scenarios will my camera tend to overexpose, or what scenarios will my camera tend to underexpose, or what scenarios will it get the exposure right? Let me back up on some of these pictures right here. I can tell you just from experience, a shot like this right here, because the background kind of dominates the whole scene, my camera will tend to overexpose that image. And so classically, as if you've got a dark background that dominates an image, cameras will tend to overexpose it. And so what I got to understand is how do I fix that in the camera before I have to fix it in post processing? Just the opposite of this, and this is the one people are most familiar with, is there's a scenario when cameras tend to underexpose pictures, and that's a bright background. So if you're shooting against a bright, cloudy sky, or more familiar with most people, if you're shooting against snow, I mean, every one of us are guilty of taking a picture of something in the snow, and when you look at the snow's all gray and kind of dull looking. It's not really bright white like you saw it. That's because the camera tends to underexpose when it's a bright background. It tends to overexpose when it's a dark background. If it's a middle tone background, like this, that's lost, not a good example. Let me find you a good example. Like this bison right here, where even though there's some dark areas in the bison, and but it's kind of dom or this prairie dog is probably a better example. Everything's kind of right in the middle of the histogram, so to speak. It's not, there's not a lot of really bright whites and there's not a really lot of really dark darks. Everything's just kind of in the middle of the histogram. The camera will tend to get that exposure perfectly each and every time. And so when I'm shooting, the workflow I talked about on keeping it simple, where I shoot an aperture priority, I set the aperture, I set the ISO, then I let the camera decide what the shutter speed is going to be. All I really think about then is when I'm looking at the scene, is the camera going to overexpose, underexpose, or get it right? And all I do is just add in exposure compensation to adjust for that as time goes on. That's the path I take. And so I think that's a big deal. And once you understand how your camera sees, and this is such an easy thing to go out with these mirrorless cameras now, it's such an easy thing to see in real time what your camera's seeing because you can turn on a live histogram and see how your camera reacts to various scenes. Uh, a lot of times, whenever I'm got, especially if I'm sitting in a blind or standing somewhere waiting on the action to happen and there's not a lot going on, I'll just do test shots just to again keep training myself in my mind to see how the camera is going to see the scene and see if it's going to get the exposure right, overexposed or underexposed. And all of this stuff, again, goes back to that first thing I talked about was trying to get it right in the camera. Now, I know you can go back and fix all of this stuff, but sometimes I ask myself just because we can do it, should we do it? And for me, I'm glad I've got the ability to fix it if I can, but I really take a lot of pride in getting it right out of the camera because, like I said, I'd rather spend more time out perfecting my photography skills and less time trying to work on images that I could have got right if I was a little more mindful to begin with. So, uh, I know I sound like a broken record, but understanding how your camera sees the scene is really, really huge. If you go to Hackberry Farm, Texas.com and go to the video part, you can scroll through the videos and see, it's a video it's called Why Your Camera Gets It Wrong, how I think it's called How Backgrounds Affect How Your Camera Sees a Scene. And you can see it right there. I do a demonstration in that video. I've got I think it's a little zebra that I've got on the scene. Same light source for each and every picture. This light source doesn't change, but the background changes each and every time. I just use poster board. I use a piece of middle tone green poster board, a piece of white poster board, and a black poster board where I don't change anything. And you can see in real time how the camera will predict a different exposure depending on what the background is. So that's huge because most of the time, I mean, there's sometimes when you'll take a picture of an animal that it dominates the whole frame, sort of like that, but that's the middle tone. But most of the wildlife shots we all take are like the quail there, and even the turkey right there. I cropped in just a little bit on that. But still the background. If you were to measure how much space the turkey takes up compared to the background takes up, uh, I think the background's a little more. Now, there's some ways around that. You can always spot meter, but that's just something else I've got to change. I use the value to metering. It just in Canon, it just kind of meters the whole scene. That's just something I've just always done. It's just less, it's one fewer knob I've got to turn and one fewer button I've got to turn. So I tend to leave my camera sort of set all the time the same way. And again, so I don't overthink things and mess it up. And I'm ready whenever the prairie dog makes his vocalization, which it happens quick. I'm ready when that thing happens, or ready when the bison strikes that perfect pose, and I'm ready for all of it. So this is this is in Kokenhof Gardens in the Netherlands. Man, that was a beautiful place. And a lot of things I've been thinking about this more and more lately, of trying to take pictures with the end in mind. I mean, I think we all get to a point, or at least I suspect we all get to a point where you get where you're just reacting to a scene, and especially with landscapes, you start thinking about what you can do with the scene in the end. So you start thinking about the end in mind of what you're trying to accomplish with the scene, and be able to just work through the steps you need to get to be able to take that picture. And so, uh, a lot of times, even with wildlife, I will think to myself, if this animal moves here in this one particular spot, this is the picture I want to make. And I'll have it in my mind. Uh, the bison's a good example. I kept telling myself in my mind, I wish that bison would move to kind of a three-quartering position. I think this is a good power pose for any kind of big male mammal. And I kept wishing to myself, I wish that animal would move in the power pose, get a shot with its head up, because if you've ever shot very many pictures of bison before, bison are doing what bison do. They graze all the time. And so it's always been a little difficult for me, even though I've seen thousands of bison in my life. It's always been a little difficult to get them with their head up, because they're always have their head down in the grass grazing around. And so I kept telling myself, if all these things will work out for me, because the bison was kind of grazing in this pose, if he'll pick his head up, I'll be ready to go. And this is the shot I want to take. So this is a good example of shooting with the end in mind. I just visualized what I wanted the animal to do, and it did it. And so I was ready for it. And the same way, yeah, with this picture here, this is in out in Death Valley, and I'd seen the building earlier in the day, and uh I'd seen the building earlier in the day and knew that the skies were going to be dark that night, and so kind of surveying the scene, and thinking about the end in mind, the kind of the reddish light, the warm light that's coming on the right side of the building, that was an ambient light that was just right down the road. And so I knew ahead of time that if that light comes on tonight, that's going to affect the scene. And so in order to balance it, I went and bought a light that I could put out front to provide a little bit ambient light on the front of the building. And so the whole thing, I'm kind of visualizing what I want in the end and shooting with the end in mind. And then sure enough, when we went back out that night, uh, that ambient light from down the road, it's just a security light like you see out in the country all the time, those sodium lights that kind of shine yellow and they give off this cast. There's nothing we could do about that. The light was going to be there. But the first practice shot we took, the whole front of the building was dark. And so I knew I had to add in that second light, and we didn't do anything special. I just put the light on the ground and let it naturally shine up there. It was a pretty dim light, but it gave enough light to kind of match the subject. And so I'll think about all these things, especially when I'm doing landscape stuff, to, what am I trying to accomplish? And again, it works the same with wildlife. If you just think with the end in mind, it helps me at least when in my helps me in my mind work through the photographic process. And if you've done pictures enough, and if you're getting in an advanced stage where you're doing more than just pressing the button and keeping your fingers crossed and hoping for the best, you understand that there's a process that you go through, a mental process you've got to go through to get your settings right, to think about the composition, to do all those things because even though you won't admit it or not, you're still thinking with the end in mind whenever you're starting that photographic process and thinking through the whole process of making pictures. And so this comes, and I didn't even think about that point, but that comes to a good point of, you want to transcend where you're, instead of just taking pictures, you're making pictures. You're controlling a lot of the variables in the process to where again, your results become predictable. I keep talking about that part, but it's just so true where you just want to get to the point where your pictures are predictable each and every time and consistent each and every time. And I've never claimed to be the greatest photographer in the world, but I am pretty consistent at being able to get what I want when I want, and when the opportunity arises. It give you a good example here, another analogy. I think golf is a perfect analogy of photography, and you may have heard me say it before, but the greatest golfers in the world play the game knowing they're never going to play it perfect. But it's the pursuit of perfection that makes it so interesting. I think photography is the same way, but with things like golf, if a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, golf was one of the things on my list of hobbies that if people asked, do you golf? I'd say, yeah, occasionally I do. I really enjoy it when I go. Well, it got where it wasn't enjoyable anymore because I wasn't willing to put in the time and effort to understand what I was doing wrong to make my results more predictable and consistent. I didn't want to be the best golfer in the world. I just wanted to make sure if I hit a ball off the tee box that it might go 150 or 200 yards each and every time, and it would go fairly straight. But instead, if I didn't whiff it, I'd hit it to the left or hit it to the right or hit it 10 yards down the fairway or whatever. It became so frustrating that I just didn't want to do it anymore. So now golf is not one of the list of things that I even include as one of my hobbies because I haven't played in forever just because it became so frustrating. And I think the same thing, whether we're talking photography or anything else you're trying to learn, applies. That really, if you can figure out the ways to make yourself consistent and predictable, don't have to be the best in the world, as long as you can be predictable and have fun doing it. I think that's what we try to do. And so to that end, I think another little thing that you do is just study the craft. I've committed most of my adult life to taking pictures, thinking about pictures, uh, going out, well, going out and taking pictures, working on pictures and post processing when I need to, thinking about photography, looking at other people's pictures, trying to figure out what they do right and do wrong. One of the coolest things about going on a workshop, whenever we kind of have a photo share, whether it's during the workshop or after the workshop's over, when I start seeing other people's pictures, is it always amazes me how people can stand in almost the same spot and have a different vision of what a scene ought to look like. And that to me, that's instructive. That's part of studying the craft and looking at other people's pictures. But I think too, part of studying the craft is understanding the processes involved in taking pictures and understanding that there's steps you got to take, just like going to the grocery store. You got to go out and get in your vehicle and start the vehicle and then go down to the end of the road and turn left and then turn right and then pull in the parking lot. Just like there's a process to going to the grocery store, there's a process to doing pictures. And so one of the things I encourage people all to do is it, when you're not taking pictures, still think about taking pictures and study it and figure out, where you need to get better. What are some things you want to improve upon? All of those things, because I have the luxury of being able to do it every day. And one of the things that an epiphany for me a few years ago, and I really feel like it helped me when I would take people out on workshops, is it dawned on me that, I've tried to make my living as a professional photographer. And so you've got to execute at a certain level each and every time, especially what I used to do doing commercial and editorial photography. But I realized, just like I said earlier, that I love playing the guitar and I love music, but I don't aspire to be George Strait. It's okay to get to a certain level and just have fun doing it. I think that's what a lot of photographers, maybe a lot of you guys that are listening today, do the same thing. And so to that extent, I think the depending on how you define where you want to be photographically speaking, I think you study the craft to the point where you just understand everything there is about it. To go back to what I keep saying, be consistent and each and every time. Here's another thing I hear a lot on workshops. A lot of these things I'm thinking about today are just things I hear people talking about around me all the time because I live in the country. I'm not a member of any camera club. I am on a day-to-day basis, I'm around very few photographers. And so whenever we do workshops and I have a chance to listen to people talk, I try to pay attention to what they're saying. And one of the things that people talk about a lot, because it helps me as a workshop leader do better. Because if we're standing in front of a beautiful mountain scene, I'll remind people, about the rule of thirds and look for a foreground object or even do a panorama. And more times than not, when you mention something like a panorama, people will say, "Oh, yeah, I always forget to do those things." And so that's what I'm saying here. Figure out what those tools in your toolbox that you know how to use and make an inventory of them. So when you go out, you can put a note on your phone, you know, don't forget to do a foreground object or panorama shots are nice. HDR is one of the things you can do. And so figure out what those inventory items are and make a list of it. So when you're out on a shoot, whether me or someone else forgets to remind you of it, you've got your own reminder of the things you're able to do from in a particular location. And with just the thought in mind of making more and more pictures. That's one thing too. Another thing someone mentioned, we were on a trip to the Smokies. They said, "Oh, I always forget about doing that slow motion water stuff." Well, that's one of the things and I do this myself. Whenever I'm going on a shoot somewhere, I'll make kind of a rough shot list and I'll put myself reminders in my phones, which now I just copy and paste the reminders. But when you're shooting pictures of water, slow shutter speeds, try to vary the shutter speeds to see what you like the best. Make sure you take a ND filter if it's really bright so you can get really slow shutter speeds. I inventory the tools I have in my toolbox, the things I understand how to do now, and I make myself a list of them so I know just be a reminder for me to do them later. And this is good homework for everybody to do today, because this will really give you a roadmap on what you feel like you need to do uh, differently from this point forward. First thing you do is make a list of your photographic strengths. Every one of us have something that we're good at in photography. Even if you're a beginner. When I was a beginner in photography, the thing I was best at from a wildlife photography standpoint, because I grew up around it, I just knew how to get close to animals. I knew how camouflage works. It was instinctive to know that you keep your sun at the back because if an animal's staring into the sun, they can't see you as good. You stick to the shadows, you wear camouflage, you keep the wind in mind. All of those little things that I knew, that was my strength early on. I just knew how to get close to animals. I can go back it's going to be interesting to see. I've recently started the process of curating all my old slides and digitizing them. And I'm just want to throw the slides away because the slide material itself deteriorates over time. So I want to digitize the old collection. But it's going to be interesting to see and go back and when I took those pictures, because I'm gonna say for the first 6 or 8 years, I took pictures when I was really a beginner and learning it. The biggest lens I had was a 200 millimeter lens, and so for me to get pictures of deer and coyotes and stuff like that, I mean, you almost had to be right on top of them. And so early on, that was my list of my photographic strengths. And so I do this today. I make an inventory of what my strengths are. What do I feel like I'm good at, and why am I good at those things? That's the second part of that equation. What am I good at? Why am I good at them? And when you start really taking the time to think in those terms, you'll start seeing a roadmap kind of appear because the opposite of your strengths is I also think it's instructive to make a list of your photographic weaknesses. What do you wish you were better at? Mine right now is I wish I was better at macro photography because I look at these macro shots I see online of these photo stacked pictures of the real close pictures of these insects and just the hidden world all around us that I hardly ever take the time to look for. That's one of my latest things I've been trying to get better at because as I inventory what I'm good at and what I'm bad at, I just realized the macro stuff is something I'm bad at. A couple of years ago, just doing the astrophotography, moonlight photography, star photography, Milky Way photography, I wasn't that good at, and I discovered that by just kind of making a list and figuring out, what I'm good at, what I'm bad at, and what things do I want to be better at. I mentioned wedding photography the other day, or the other day, a few minutes ago, wedding photography or little babies. I mean, I could go through the mechanics and get them technically right and do that properly. That would be my strength. So just understanding how cameras work. But my weakness is uh the really good wedding photographers, the people that make a lot of money doing that kind of stuff, are they're so good at what they do. I just know that I'm so weak in that skill set I could never be that. And so it also helps you figure out where to manage your time. There's some things I don't want to be a good wedding photographer because that has zero interest for me. I don't want to be a good baby photographer. I don't want to be a good sports photographer. I don't want to be a good senior photographer. I just want to be good at nature and wildlife and rural lifestyles and rural people and rural portraiture. That's the stuff I want to be good at. And so when I continue to evolve as a photographer and I continue to learn, that's the beautiful thing about this. It's lifelong learning. It's like I said a while ago about golf. You never play the game right. You just try to it's just a pursuit of perfection. And so as I continue to go along, I continue to make a list of my strengths and weaknesses. What am I do I feel like I'm really doing right now? And why am I doing those things right? What is it about that makes me get wildlife, be pretty consistent with wildlife photography? But what are my weaknesses? Like with macro, what do I need to do to get better? And I may uncover, I'll show you right now. I just One of the things I realized in my weakness on macro photography is I had the lenses, but I didn't have the right equipment, and so I just spent $120 or whatever it is for this little contraption the other day, and it's a flash diffuser. And I found out as I was researching it and trying to figure out how do I get better at what I do, I figured out all the people that are taking really good, compelling macro shots are using that, not maybe not that one, but a similar kind of flash diffuser, and they're adding a flash. And so that was the aha moment for me. So I realized to get really, really deep depth of field when you're shooting macro, you got to shoot at f16 or f22 or something like that, or focus stack. But you also have to have a light source to really, because the higher your ISO goes, of course, your shutter speeds get lower and you start having blurry pictures. And so that's what people are using to really bring out all that color. And so that was my epiphany. And I did that by just, again, old fashioned pen and paper, writing this stuff down and making a list of all that stuff. Oh, this was a tool in my toolbox when I went to the Netherlands. I never really defaulted to that, but I wrote it down in my tools in my toolbox list. And when I got there, I looked at it like, what am I leaving out here? And I realized, oh, try focus stacking. And I did. And it's pretty incredible when you do focus stacking on a picture like this, how hyper focus everything is. That may not come across it on the screen, but it really made a difference when I focus stack these pictures as opposed to just shooting at f22. Because again, the problem with f22 is with a little bit of wind blowing and you get those slow shutter speeds, and I really didn't want to shoot at super high ISOs, you get some motion blur. So I was able to shoot a lower ISO, focus stack these pictures, combine them in post processing to get really, really deep depth of field on these tulip pictures. And I would never would have thought about that unless I would have put that tool in my proverbial toolbox. It would remind me to do it when I got on site. And then we're kind of coming to the end here. I think I've only got one or two more, but we're right on time. But develop a workflow with a few moving parts. And I've been alluding to this the whole time I've been talking about it. When it comes to landscape photography, mountains aren't going to move, trees aren't going to move. So you've got a little bit more time to be deliberate with it. But still, when you've got fleeting light or you've got a little slit in the clouds and the sun's going to shine through and you've really got 2 minutes to capture maybe a scene of a lifetime, especially if you're traveling somewhere afar and you may not ever see that again, it's helpful to have a workflow, your photographic process workflow where you can get to from where you are now to where you need to be with the fewest steps as possible. And I say this in a vague kind of way because everyone's workflow is going to be different. I'd alluded to earlier, one of the things that I do when you go back and look at all these wildlife pictures I took, they were all taken with the same basic settings. Aperture priority, my lens is wide open because I really like that shallow depth of field. I just like the way that looks. And and then I let the camera set the shutter speed. So I've got very few moving parts. So there's not very many places that if I've got it set up right and I'm ready to go, as soon as a quail steps out like that and is leaning out from around cover, I'm ready to go because I don't have a whole lot of moving parts, a whole lot of things that I've got to think about to get my camera set up. And so and I've seen it before, you'll be shooting side by side with someone and maybe they get a picture you don't. And the reason why I might not have got a picture or they might not have got a picture because they're too busy fiddling with their camera. And so they're let me get back to where I was real fast. And so it tells me if you miss shots and you miss them consistently, maybe your workflow is a little too complicated. And so again, I don't mean this in post processing. I mean it when you're in the field making the picture. Figure out how you can get from point A to point B the quickest, and it's different for everybody. That's why I'm not being real specific on how to say this. I can tell you, I can be specific for myself and just say I shoot aperture priority, open the lens wide open, and set the ISO to where I think I need to be at that particular time of day based on the lighting conditions, and then I just let the whole instinct part of the proper camera handling techniques take over from there. And so those are my
Hey
few.
Russell.
Hey,
Hi, this is Linda. Can I ask a question?
yes.
Yeah, so yeah, to your point about w- shooting wide open. Um so I just got a new Canon 100 to 500 telephoto lens, and it's variable aperture.
Hmm.
And so at that 500 level, it's 7.1. And then it at the lower, like the lower um, numbers, you're going to be able to open up your aperture more at 100 than 500. So yeah, it's like 4.5 at
Yeah.
100, and
Yeah.
it goes up to 7.1
Uh-huh.
500. So here's my question for you, Russell, is that I mean, I also like that. I like to be as wide open as possible. Um, but obviously, if I use the 500 focal length, that's not going to be as wide open as um the shorter focal lengths, right? So it's my question is, like, the trade-off is, would it be better to shoot a scene at a lower focal length and crop it than go to 500 and lose some of that effect of being wider open? And I hope
Yeah,
that question makes sense.
it does. So really there's a well let me do this, Linda. Let me finish. I'm almost done with this presentation
Oh,
and
okay, sure.
let me answer that question right at the very end.
Okay, thanks.
Uh and I understand completely what you're saying, and I'll be able to answer that. This was a funny scene here. This was a prairie dog. It's like I, I guess in that prairie dog's mind, this would be akin if aliens landed in your front yard because they were so troubled by the presence of that turtle walking through their town, they didn't know what to think of it. I have every reason to think that's the first turtle that those prairie dogs had ever seen in their life. And the turtle was lost because it's a red-eared turtle, which is a red-eared slider, which is a water turtle, and he was a long way from water. So how he ended up there, I don't know. But the prairie dogs were all concerned about it to the point where they would run over to it and they'd push it and then jump away real quick. It's kind of cool. And this is really the last thing here. This is the magic bullet on all of it. And this is the thing that, uh, if I'm being a little cynical here, so be it. But this is the thing that camera manufacturers and software manufacturers don't want to tell you because they understand, they want people to think that the latest software or the latest camera or the latest lens is the solution to all your problems. But if you accept that, you also have to accept the fact that right now is the only time good pictures are ever made. Good pictures weren't made in the past, which that's just not true. Good pictures have always been made with whatever equipment people had at the time. And so the thing that comes down to is just a mastery of what you're doing. And the only way you become a master at whatever you're doing, whatever that activity is, you just got to practice. And it's I've got the luxury of being able to go out every single day if I want to and take pictures. I understand a lot of people don't have that luxury. You become people become weekend warriors where they're going out on the weekends and that's the only time they can relegate themselves to photography, or maybe it's a vacation. But I encourage everybody on the in-between time stuff. Maybe you're just sitting out in your backyard or your front yard and you're watching your dog or cat run around the yard. practice on that animal. Or you've got a nice little flower garden. Try to figure out how to make it look where that flower garden's not in the, in your backyard in the middle of a subdivision. And there's ways of doing that. And so it's the whole thing is just get out and practice. Again, people are trying to sell you stuff that's not always the answer they want to tell you. They want to think, well, your solution is buying whatever the latest product is, and those products help. I'm not going to say they don't, but there's no substitute for good old fashioned time on task and practice in the end. So, with that said, uh, any questions? Linda, you asked the question about would it be better to shoot looser and crop as opposed to the variable aperture? I think it's going to be a little bit of a nuanced answer here, so bear with me a second. The way that apertures work and the way that they blur the background is a function of the focal length you choose. It's a function of a lot of things, but to cut to the chase, it's a function of the focal length you choose and the distance between the subject and the background. So I say that to say my first instinct would be not to crop because that you introduce a whole other set of variables into there that you've got to deal with because with photography, if you've been doing it long enough, it's cause and effect on everything. You raise the app, you raise you go with a smaller aperture in the lens, it affects the shutter speed or it affects the ISO. So my point is f7.1 in a in a in that 500 millimeter lens, if you practice good technique and you kind of think with the shot with the end in mind, this burrowing owl right here is a good example. This was shot at f6.3, not much different than 7.1 at 500 millimeters, but I knew to get that really soft background, what I had to do is get low on my angle so the background in relation looked to be further away from the owl. If I'd have been standing up behind the ground behind the owl, it would have been relatively closer, and you wouldn't have this good soft background. So that's what I mean with shoot with the end in mind on that point I made earlier. And so you can still achieve those goals. I was with someone the other day. They had that new, this week, they had that Canon, oh gosh, the 2 to 800, and I think it's maybe F9 or F11 on the long end when you get to 800, excuse me. But when they shot with that, because they were mindful on their background, they could achieve similar results to what you would see here. And so I think that goes back to the to my days of learning on film when cropping, the picture you got was the picture you got. There was no cropping after the fact because we had no way of ingesting those slides into a computer and doing any kind of manipulation to them, or I didn't at the time. And so I always just tried to strive to get it right in the camera, get as close as what I see in my mind in the camera. And I think to your point, that's what you try to do is just, again, think about the background. And you can, this is, so the background part and understanding how it works with backgrounds, you can go get a stuffed animal and you can do this at your house. You can set out on your deck and, put your little stuffed animal on the rail and then shoot at eye level with the animal with the background, relatively far behind it. Shoot at that f7.1 and then see what the background looks like. Set it on the ground and then shoot it from a standing position. And with the same settings, you'll be able to see how much difference it makes. And so when I talk about the point I made earlier about study the craft. That's how I learned all that stuff. When I wasn't out taking pictures, I would set up stuffed animals and just think about it. If the background is here and I'm shooting from here, how does that affect the way the scene looks in the end? So I know it's kind of a nuanced answer. There's really no one specific answer, but I think to be real specific on your question, I would shoot at 500 millimeters, get it as close optically as you can, and think about the backgrounds when you're shooting at 7.1 as opposed to just shooting wider at a smaller aperture and cropping. One last point I'll make on this, if anyone else has any questions, and then stay with me. If y'all want to continue the conversation, well, I'll just go ahead and do that. If people want to take that down, if you have any questions after we get done today, feel free to reach out to me. Uh, when I said that the background is a function of the aperture you choose, the distance from the subject to the background, and the focal length you choose, the focal length makes a huge difference on the way the backgrounds look too, because I'm no optical physicist, so I can't tell you this why, but the more you have telephoto, the more blurry you can make the background. So if I shot this with a wide angle lens, like 24 millimeters at f6.3, like I shot this one at, the background wouldn't be, you'd have to be close to the subject, but the background wouldn't be nearly as out of focus unless I was just right next to the subject. Then I might could make it out of focus, but it wouldn't be that out of focus. So just by shooting at 500 millimeters, whether it's f7.1 or f8 or f11, whatever, just by virtue of shooting telephoto, you're going to make the way the lenses work, you're going to make it out of focus in the background. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? Oops, I hit the wrong spot. I know there's some stuff coming up in chat. I need to look at those. Might have been the chicken lottery.
Russell, this is Susan. I have a question here. Somebody else did too. And I know, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
We, having just been with you, and I should have really made sure I understood the answer. But so your aperture priority, you have a standing bird and a flying bird. How does your camera know to adjust for the shutter speed? I mean, you
Well,
might need 3,000 for the flying bird, but something much less. So if your aperture priority, how does that work?
so the the short answer is the camera doesn't know if it's flying or if it's sitting. And so that's where you got to use your most important tool, and that's understanding the scene in front of you. I tell people this all the time. If you use good proper if you use proper camera handling techniques, you'll be surprised at how slow a shutter speed you can shoot even moving animals. And so that's one thing. And so what I tend to do, Susan, if I need to switch, if anything, I'll keep the aperture the same. And then if I need to get a higher shutter speed, I'll just change the ISO and that way in the same light, you can change the ISO by a couple of stops and be able to get more shutter speed when you need it on the flying birds, and then change it back if you don't need it for the stable birds. And so either way, that's me only changing one thing on my camera in the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I got to go practice that. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, it looks like Linda won the chicken lottery. So Linda, send me an email. You've got my email address, so I've got your stuff. Linda Medine, I think is how you pronounce her name. She was the first one to see the chicken in the background. I thought I heard one walked in when I turned around and looked earlier, but I wasn't sure. Uh, and then Susan, I just saw your chat. You asked that, and then Donna asked the same question. Yeah, Kevin, I think Kevin answered the question in there. So good question. Oh, Linda says she didn't think she saw the chicken. She thought it was a fan moving. So I'll go back and look. If not, Kevin Newton, you were the second person to see the chicken, but I'll go back and look based on the time you say here. I can go back and look on the video and we'll confirm it because the rules we follow for the chicken lottery are bound by international law. So we got to make sure we get all this right. So I'll go back and me and the judges will confer on who wins the chicken lottery for today. All right. We have any other questions at all? Well, thank y'all for joining me today. Like I said, if you pay attention to your email, I'm going to send this out pretty soon. As soon as I get it posted to YouTube, I'll send it out. I'll send out the link. I'll send out the meeting notes to everyone that was here today. And as always, stay in touch if you have any questions about any of this stuff. I appreciate you guys being with me today, and I will talk to everybody soon. Thank y'all.
Thank you.